sorry, I have just a quick question.
Yes, please.
Because I've heard of the term story, but I don't necessarily know what it is. Is a story a requirement?
A story it's written off of a requirement that captures some piece of work that needs to be done. And you can see how it's written right there on the board. You take the role of the user and you say, as this user, I need something so that I have some outcome, okay? And as a part of that story, you will always have acceptance criteria. And acceptance criteria is all about, from the stakeholder perspective, how would we know that this feature is complete from a functional perspective? That's what acceptance criteria is all about. Every story has one. We'll talk about that more as we go through. All right, so these ideas come down and they populate this warehouse of ideas that sits out here, all these ideas. Some of them are high priority, some are lower priority, some are big effort, some are small effort. They all sit out here. Anybody have an idea what that inventory of ideas is called?
Backlog.
It's called the product backlog, yes. And the product backlog is owned by the product owner. Okay? So we will introduce our first of these three roles, first major role, this individual right here called the product owner. Now, you saw in that video, they said that the product owner has in their toolkit, one of the most important things that they have, as I like to say, they have the ability and the responsibility to say no if necessary. Okay? Now, why would they say no? There's only really one reason why they would say no. I'm not adding this idea, this feature to the backlog.
In order to not prevent true requirements or needs to be prioritized.
Yes, I think another way to say that is, if this feature does not add value to the product, we don't want it going in the backlog. And that's what the product owner is all about. Watching these ideas, these features as they come from this factory that is the stakeholders, and trying to determine, do these add value to the product or not? If they do, then they will get added to the backlog. If not, most likely they will get trashed. Okay? So we've got all of this backlog of ideas or features that have been looked at by the product owner, and they believe that they should be in the backlog. They add value to the product in some way. Okay? Now, Dee mentioned we have this process called backlog refinement. This is done concurrently throughout our release, throughout the sprinting. Generally, we do this. My teams do this every week. I have 3 teams. They do this every single week on Wednesday at 1:30, okay, for a couple of hours. And this process is all about prioritizing, sorting, sequencing, sizing, sometimes splitting if these things are too big. It's work, refinement work that we do to improve this backlog. The backlog needs to be improved. That's one thing that is very different about Waterfall and Agile. Waterfall believes that up front, when we do all of our analysis up front, that the backlog is healthy and it's able for us to build the project on the backlog up front. In Agile, we believe the backlog needs work. We recognize it in the beginning as unhealthy. There's a lot of things in here that are maybe wrong, or that the analyst didn't understand, or technology is changing during the release. There's things that we know that are not quite right here. This is why we lean so heavily on transparency, inspect and adapt, and feedback, because we actually want to edit these items, to create new ones, to make updates to this backlog so that it becomes healthy over time. That's important to us. All right, so the product owner owns this backlog. They are all about trying to find the high priority items and delivering them over to this build team first, the high priority items. So this build team right here, I also like to think of this as a factory. I like to call it the build team. Sometimes if you're doing some research, they'll call it the development team, the dev team. I like to call it the build team because even here at 3M, we're using Scrum for so much more than software development. But whether it's infrastructure or whatever it is, generally they do some sort of build process. Okay? So I like to call it the build team. And over here, I'm going to add one more factory. And this one is story author. Now, we don't have a role called story author any longer, but it is a process that happens where we know that these features, these ideas in the backlog, they need to be turned into proper stories that have acceptance criteria, that are well written, that are sized properly, in order to be able to be fed to the build team. Okay? Now, I put a stop sign here and I gave it a number 1. This is our first of the 4 events, and I will just mention it now. We'll get into it in much more detail tomorrow, but I'll mention it now because it affects our role, the product owner, and this is called the sprint planning here. I like to use a stop sign because in this flow of activities, we stop right here. We do not keep going until we've done the sprint planning meeting. Okay? Sprint planning meeting happens for every single sprint before we begin sprinting. Okay? And it is largely owned by the product owner, although certainly the build team is there, Scrum Master is there oftentimes. But it is all about what? And this is why the product owner gets is so involved in this, because the first part of this meeting is about what? What is it that we're going to pull from this product backlog and move it to the build team as a part of this sprint that we are planning for?
Prioritization.
Right. It is prioritization, that's right. We want to do the high priority stories early. And let me tell you why. This is part of the secret sauce of Scrum. You know, Jeff Sutherland wrote this book, he co-authored Scrum. He wrote this book that says how to do twice the work in half the time, okay? And part of the reason that those kind of claims can be made is there's a few things that I call secret sauce, and this is one of them. Studies have shown over and over again that 80% of the value in the backlog is in 20% of the items. 80% of the backlog the value in the backlog is in 20% of the items. Think about Microsoft Word. Okay, you're using Microsoft. Everybody here uses Microsoft Word, of course, yep. And you just think about all the features that are in Microsoft Word. How many things do you use 80% of the features? How many? 60, 50, 40, 30. Maybe we're getting close now, right? 20, 10%, 15, that's about where we live. And so for you, that's a true statement, that when you use Word, 80% of your value is coming from 20% or less of the features that they created, okay? So what we're all about from a product owner standpoint, the product owner is all about finding those 20% first, delivering them first. Because, and we saw this in the video, that gives us a steep value curve early, and that's what we want. When we give a steep value curve early, then we allow the stakeholders to be able to respond to this by seeing the demonstration, seeing what it is that's going to give them the most value. And oftentimes, they're, you know, once we get going on this, they're like, you know what? Half of these things that I thought were so important, not so important after all. Now that I see what you've given me, I can use what you've given me. It works great. I like it. There's a lot of this I maybe don't need, so we can trim the tail and accomplish much by doing less. And this is that important principle called maximizing the amount of work not done. Okay? So as we go through this life cycle, this is the side that the product owner worries about, right? And out of this factory is coming well-written stories. We're going through the sprint planning meeting, and this is where we make our commitment. This is where we say, these 4 stories are going to be what we're going to commit to for this sprint. Okay, that's what happens. And the entire team, the build team, product owner, Scrum Master, everybody commits to that. Okay? And this commitment here has a name. This name is called the sprint backlog. We have the product backlog over here, this big inventory. Once we have the sprint planning meeting that is owned by the product owner, and we make a commitment, this is called the sprint backlog. This is what we intend to do in this sprint.